Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and this episode is very important. We have our world famous speaker, Professor David Smith, Mr. Marshalls, as well as Professor David J. Kelly. We will discuss about sustainable development goal. Mr. Marshall, he is actually discussing with his company. Yes, we already working with different countries' government with the projects of waste management. Uh, Today we're going to discuss some point as well as we have our Professor David Kelly. He is an inventors of automations and this kind of thing. So he going to share with us how this kind of organizations can use artificial intelligence. Even though I can share some of the case study, even though Asia Pacific now we have shortage of labor after the COVID-19. Maybe automations will be the new solution for Asia Pacific. We will learn from these today's sessions. I want to give floor, Mr. Marshall.
Thank you, Sharif, and thank you, David, Mark, and David J. Kelly for joining us today. Today, could you put up the slide for the first slide that we have, Sharif?
Okay.
Today is, yeah, go ahead.
You just continue.
Oh, yeah, right.
I'm sharing the slide.
Yeah. So today is about SDGs, their opportunities and challenges, and what David Smith and Mark and I have put together is a discussion. It's really a discussion for everybody here and for the folks out there about public-private partnerships, what David likes to call P3s, David Smith, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, especially for the developing world. And this is in our series on getting serious on the climate crisis. So we have several topics that I would like to run by you. And if we can see the slides, that would be helpful.
Thank you. I just want to give floor to Professor David J. Kelly because he is expert of artificial intelligence. So Professor David J. Kelly's one thing right now, every country has challenges. How automation can help Asia Pacific, artificial intelligence can help Asia Pacific for industrializations and running the industries and everything. If you give some sort of advice, Professor David J. Kelly.
Well, I mean that's a very sort of generic, I guess almost problem space. You can use automation to automate just about anything, and AI is, you know, if we're referring to machine learning or these kinds of technologies, there's almost an infinite amount of ways of applying them to a problem. And typically with a business, you have a business that has some kind of data, whether it's in the Asia Pacific or whatever region is less important, and it's just being able to understand the data you have, and AI is kind of the tool for doing that. You know, from a general sense, you know, it's making it so that as a business you can do more with the data you have, and ideally less work, so that you can either optimize what you're doing for the business or minimize the amount of effort that you're putting into it, or being able to do things that you just wouldn't be able to do otherwise. For example, take a farm, for example. You know, if you're collecting data over a wide kind of a wide area, you can adjust, like say it's some kind of aquaponics or similar system, like maybe rice paddies and things like that, where you're able to adjust water chemistry or detect problems in different parts of the farm based on all of the data you get, where you can make corrections before it actually becomes a problem. And that's, I think, you know, the biggest point with AI is just being able to use it as a tool to make better use of the things that you have.
Thank you, Professor. Professor David J. Kelly will be the expert panelist for today's session. Mr. Marshalls, he actually introducing a solution for Asia Pacific, especially for the developing world. Tomorrow we have very important meeting with the Australian, especially the Adelaide lab. So hopefully it will be very effective contributions from World Talent Economy Forum for the developing world. Mr. Marshalls, you can discuss your public-private partnerships, and after all of your team discussion, Professor David J. Kelly can contribute for artificial intelligence views, and as well as maybe he definitely has a view for public-private partnership. Mr. Marshall.
Thank you, Sharif, and thank you, David J. Kelly. That was that's an important issue, artificial intelligence, and it does connect to the public-private partnerships and the Sustainable Development Goals, and we'll get into that. But we want to go to the next slide, Sharif, which shows the topics. And basically, the topics are uniting the public-private partnerships with the Sustainable Development Goals. A new regional model that's emerging that David Smith will discuss, and the developing world opportunities for new model adoption, which is going to be both by David Smith and Mark Sabin, and any contributions from David J. Kelly. So I'd like to go to the first slide, which is the private-public partnerships and what they are. That would be the next slide, and I'll hand it off to David Smith.
Sharif, go down to the third slide. Thank you. As we've talked before, public-private partnerships are one of the things that, as we begin to look at particularly infrastructure projects and others, are very important in today's global environment. We have used them in some of the Western nations for quite a while, and they're now begin to use fairly broadly in the developing world. A public-private partnership, or as Marshall said, I like to refer to them as P3s, is an agreement between two or more public and private sectors, usually of a long-term nature. And the public sectors usually involve multiple elements, government elements, academia, and others like that, with a different type of private sector initiatives. The way P3s got started was really a product of the public management of the late 20th century. And the challenge you begin to see is there were very fast technology advances. And the whole view of how you related in the global environment began to change because, as some of you have heard me say before, geography is no longer about a place on the map. It's about where you have the competencies and capabilities to do what you want to do. And the rapid advances in technology and the fact globalization was hitting strained many governments, not just with cash to do the projects, but also the competencies and capabilities to do the projects. And that's where the concept of public-private partnerships really got its roots in place and begin to move. Just like Sharif does with these broadcasts, we see that it takes a broad group of people in a global environment to talk about the wide variety of opportunities, technologies, and challenges that are presented for this. That is why public-private partnerships are such a good product to use when you get past the stage of saying, oh, this is something we should consider, to actually beginning to plan it, move it, fund it, and build it and operate it. And that's where public-private partnerships excel, because you begin to have a group of stakeholders, you begin to move more transparency into the operation, which transparency is an important part of public-private partnerships. And so that is really how P3s begin to get started. And Sharif, can we go to the next one?
I had a question for you, David. Since we have David Kelly here with us today, it seems that what the AI component would do in benefiting the P3s would be adding a level of being able to manage the vast amount of information that has to be accessed for the public-private partnership to be able to actually function at its optimum.
Well, to be able to use AI like that, you're going to have a fundamental understanding of the data. AI isn't just like a magic bullet. If you don't understand the data you're consuming, yes, it absolutely could be used to manage that, but you're going to have to make sure that you kind of understand what you're looking at so you can use it in a way that makes sense. It's not always a magic bullet. I guess that's
Yeah, and I wasn't thinking of it so much in terms of it being a magic bullet, but actually as part of, particularly on the private side, whether that becomes part of one of the tool sets that you want to be able to access and have that knowledge and integrate that knowledge into that that full range of what's possible when you bring in the private sector and the public sector together.
yeah,
Yeah.
it could be used like that. That makes sense.
Let me jump in here a second, and David, I'd love your reaction to this. One of my prior companies, which I was the founder and CEO of, we produced a set of software where it was optimized for public-private partnerships. And I'll give you a great example. In the United States, David, as you're aware, we've built over the last 20 years a lot of toll roads to help solve our transportation infrastructure problems. And one of the challenges you have with toll roads is you've got the state government, you have the federal government, you have the local community governments. For example, here in Central Texas, we have the Central Texas Regional Mobility thing. You have the Texas Department of Transportation, which is actually managing the problem. The funding for this came out of Spain, where the concessionaire was doing the partial funding for it. And then you had the prime contractor and a whole mess of other subcontractors building it. And so we built a software for managing the data that you were talking about, David, where it was divided really well, secure and indexed. But we had a section in it called ball and court. And it was whose court is the ball in for the data. Because when you have public-private partnerships, you want to make sure that everyone has access to the basic data, but particularly in public-private partnerships, particularly the concessionaire and some of the others, the state in particular, they don't want the prime contractor or the people providing the money to see some of the back office processes they do where they use it. So we had to develop this software to manage the data. And yes, we began to use a lot of data science tools with it. David knows that I tend to like to use the machine learning and the other names as opposed to AI, because AI is just such a broad catch-all terms. But it's very important that you manage the data in a way that you can make meaningful decisions off of it so that you can begin to use it and have the oversight and insights into what's happening on the projects. One of the projects which we've used that software on with multiple contractors, multiple public-private partnerships, is the Interstate 35 project in the United States that runs from Mexico up to Canada. And that is the software that's still being used today to deal with these multitude of public-private partnerships on a very, very large scale infrastructure problems in multiple states, multiple segments and things. And that's what you do. And that's why the slide that's up there on the screen right now is so important, because when you look at public-private partnerships, in the last century, when you begin to see some of them put together, they were often in self-contained regional clusters where you had the development, the services, the research, the manufacturing, the funding, all there locally. Now we're seeing them where we are networking regions together. And you begin to get, for example, with the projects I just mentioned, we were networking people from the Mexico border to the Canadian border across all the states, across all the cities, across all the jurisdictions with hundreds of contractors, hundreds of government agencies, probably 75 academic institutions as part of those projects over the year. And what's interesting with the fact that you can do this as a public-private partnership is you can link them together, just like we see now where you're linking specialized network regions. You do the same with linking the project public-private partnerships to solve even larger problems that you're trying to deal with, and particularly in the infrastructure base. So if I'm beginning to look at projects to solve the sustainable development initiatives, you're going to have projects which are in a single location, but across the country, you might have dozens of these types of projects where you're going to be looking at different ways to tackle the sustainable development issues. And you have to begin to handle that data in a way where you have its applicability to the region, to the local problem, as well as the problems where you begin to network it to. And that's why a good understanding of, as David mentioned, the data requirements are extremely important, and establishing a very strong data lexicon and a data model that can be used across these, and an understanding of the roles and permissions for the different pieces of data. But in the end of it, the public-private partnership will set the rules for all of those and set the beginnings for it. And in my experience, it also allows for faster implementation of the type of projects you see happening. I've seen Regina coming on from Brazil. If you go and look at some of the projects in Brazil, particularly the ones around the fact that Brazil had wanted a challenge to move from consuming a lot of petroleum products in Brazil to more of the green products. Petrobras and others, FGV University, and a bunch of private companies and the government came together and actually put in place a series of public-private partnerships in Brazil to begin to work with these issues too. And to me, as you look at large oil producers, which Petrobras is one of the larger ones, they've actually began to, over the last 15 years, dramatically change to a greener product in Brazil and things than they were before. And a lot of this was utilized through the public-private partnerships, which I fortunately was able to help develop with FGV University in Sao Paulo and Rio as the other lead from the academic side to do this, and actually train the people inside the companies and the government on how to manage and implement public-private partnerships. So this is a project that can work globally. It works in small projects and very large projects, which is one of the unique advantages of this type of approach, to where you have specialized, connected projects and regions working together. So, Marshall, do you want to come back on this?
I'd like to jump in here, David, just because one of the things we're looking at doing is linking the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and everything that you're saying about the various sizes and the scope, really, of what these types of projects, where we're looking at doing things to mitigate what's happening with climate change around the world, and particularly in the developing world. There are 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, all of which really need to be addressed at the same time. And there's a sense of urgency about getting this done, because what we're seeing right now with sea level rises and what's happening particularly in Asia, and a lot of in the island communities that are seeing the impact of climate change on their local economies and land masses. We're also seeing this in terms of farming. So what David Kelly was talking about in terms of farming, we need to be able to shift so many different aspects of what's happening in terms of agriculture, and in terms of trying to address some of these things things like poverty, things like hunger, things like agriculture, things like what's happening with the changing of salinity of the seas, with the melting of the glaciers. All these things need to be addressed. And not only do we have a sense of urgency in terms of the short term of being able to deal them, but one of the things that we're looking to, and I think that is very helpful about what the public-private partnerships allows us to do, is actually address things not only in the short term, but also in the midterm, so that we're looking at what we can do in terms of getting these projects launched, implementing them, and getting them out into the arenas where the SDGs can do the most good, where we actually need to begin to make some impact. And we see that largely in the developing world, that's a key thing. And also, we also have to look at the long term. So when we're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, these things are really looking at changing the entire economy globally and bringing in a different sense of balance from one part of the world to the other. So all these things tie very closely into the participation, not only of governments at a national level, but as you were saying, the local governments, the regional governments, all participating together in a way. And I think this really ties into why the AI component of this begins to become so important, because there is massive amounts of data that need to be analyzed and be able to be worked with in order to be able to be applied to the benefit of what we're trying to accomplish.
Thank you, Mark. That's a really good point. One of the things that we know as we move forward, we're developing world opportunities for a new model adoption, and we have several outcome. We have an outcome-driven approach, which we think is that David Smith has generously provided to us as a means that he has actually implemented in the past, that we believe is viable for the developing countries around the world. Since COP26 took place, there's a group called the GFANZ Alliance, which has committed 130 trillion US dollars to development banks and other infrastructure banks and central banks in the developing world. Their challenge is, how do they apply that money to ensure not only that the money is spent properly, but what outcomes are they looking for? And so part of that is that the issue that GFANZ is addressing is there greenwashing when you apply this for sustainable development? And as Mark pointed out, David Kelly's concept or approach to that it's a complex issue addressing AI, and as David Smith pointed out, AI is generally a broad brush stroke, but it needs to be used as a tool to be able to manage these outcomes. So one of the things that I'd like to discuss is the outcome-driven approach, and as you can see on this particular slide, we have 5 outcomes that are preferred outcomes. The application of innovative and disruptive technologies, which we do have. We now have those technologies. As an example, we have pyrolytic carbon capture and storage technology, which has been around 80 years, but is now scaled at a large scale to convert waste products, such as different types of waste throughout Malaysia and other countries in the developing world. It could be rice hulls. It could be other types of waste, woody biomass. It could be cow manure, pig litter, chicken litter, and convert that into what we call products. Now, those products are not necessarily dresses and shoes. They're products that actually reduce the environmental impacts themselves. So, for instance, you can take certain types of biomass and convert it into green building materials to create a more sustainable outcome. But you need some standards to do that. Another preferred outcome is the alignment of economic development goals, and those economic development goals have to be aligned in the sense that If they're not aligned, then what happens, you end up with several potential negative outcomes. One could be the greenwashing that I mentioned before, and what tools can you bring to bear to prevent that from happening? And number two, you may have a disparity of economics where you have a highly rich part of the population, which is maybe only 1% of the population, and the rest of the population is in poverty. Obviously, the Sustainable Development Goals, part of that is addressing poverty. That's one of the Sustainable Development Goals. So when you have this outcome-driven approach where you want an alignment, where you bring more people from out of poverty into the middle class and into a state of a better economic value, then you have an opportunity to do that by aligning the innovative and disruptive technologies such as pyrolysis to create a material known as biochar, creating jobs and thereby reducing carbon footprints in those areas. Another outcome is alignment of competitiveness, profitability, and the relevance of drivers of corporations. This is where the climate bond really comes in very well, because by bringing the climate bond to the table, we adjust some of the other two preferred outcomes. One outcome is the climate bond has a strict taxonomy, so it prevents people that are issuing these bonds from greenwashing. They have to, for instance, the one that we're proposing to deploy is the taxonomy on waste management, where you convert brownfield entities in, let's say, any country, could be in Rwanda, could be in Malaysia, could be in Pakistan, and convert those into greenfield opportunities. Again, achieving the alignment of economic development goals, bringing people out of poverty, creating a better sustainable environment, and creating valuable, good-paying jobs, and education, which is another sustainable development goal. And who pays for that? Predominantly, you want that. Obviously, governments should play a role and should have a stake in the ground. But what we're suggesting is that we also get corporate entities who buy these bonds to help fund that process. And then the fourth preferred outcome is dynamic and future-proof architecture. And as David Smith has talked about this, I think in previous presentations, that's a 3 to 5 year context. So that goes to what Mark was speaking about the midterm and long-term outcomes of the SDGs getting an outcome out there that aligns all these elements. And of course, the fifth outcome is to instill behavioral changes across the providers and the end users. And end users means two types of clients. It means governments as clients for this process, and corporate clients, the people who could fund it through a climate bond. And now, I always talk about the climate bond as opposed to green bonds, because green bonds is a category, but it's also confusing because there is a specific green bond, just as there are environmental sustainable governance bonds, ESG bonds. But those bonds are not rated. Morningstar and Moody's and Fitch all rate the climate bonds out of Europe because of the strict taxonomies. The others don't have those. So we want to marry all this together. And what we want an outcome-driven approach so that countries can raise the level of education, meet most of the, if not all of the sustainable development goals simultaneously while addressing climate change. Now, one of the things that the UN made very clear when they developed the Sustainable Development Goals, and they were brought out and highlighted at COP26, is that the SDGs create an ability to address climate change. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are really predicated on climate change issues. And that is an important outcome that has to be driven so that we can have countries create better value for their citizens and for their economies. And that brings us to the next slide. And that's what we call the benefits to the clients. So Sharif, if you could go there. And when we're talking about both the sovereign clients, that's the countries, and the especially in the developing world, We get job creation, we get foreign direct investment performance, especially through climate bonds. We get knowledge and tech transfer, and we develop macroeconomic performance. That is really the critical outcomes that we need, that the SDGs, if we follow the SDGs, we can get to that. And the corporate clients, on the other hand, they're looking for speed to market. They're obviously looking for profitability because that's their corporate entities and that's their mission, part of their mission. And their market perception of relevance and innovation is important, especially in today's world. Today, on any social media platform like LinkedIn or Facebook, you can see there's groups forming about ESG, environmental, sustainable, and governance ratings, and it's all the rage in the United States, in Europe, and also in the developing world. How do you measure ESG? What tools do you bring to the table? Well, by combining the Climate Bond Initiative bonds together with the performance mission, we get growth, we reduce risk, we engender behavioral change where people want to learn how to change their environment for the better and create healthy outcomes for their children, less disease, and we create data value and monetization of that data value, which comes back to the AI component that Sharif introduced through David. And so what we have here is for sovereign nations, P3 provide innovation in the early stage of solutions development and the application of disruptive technology. And it's quite ironic that the disruptive technology is perceived as disruptive when it's been around for 70, 80 years. But it's changed because the purpose it was used for before is not the purpose we're recommending today, which is to convert waste into revenue and monetization for both the private companies and for the sovereign clients. So Sharif, at this point, I'd like to open it to discussion, which would be the next slide. And that is sovereign governments we're asking them to back climate bonds to unleash P3s and achieve the SDGs. So more than happy to open it up for discussion from the people out there in the audience or on the panel. Or Sharif, if you have questions. You're muted, Sharif. There you go.
Okay, thank you. This is actually excellent presentations, and I believe that our audience also like your presentation. First thing first, Professor David J. Kelly, if you want to give some observation or analysis on these presentations, especially from my side, I just want to know more because you are developing AGI, you are working with policy for developing any kind of macro initiative. Policy is very important, as well as developing nations, like country like India, Bangladesh, or Pakistan, Indonesia, they have dependency to the developed nations for policy development. Let's say Mr. Marshall want to develop this waste management system, example for Chittagong divisions. So definitely the city corporations and government need better policy. How your organizations in the futures, they can, like your artificial intelligence, can contribute for this public-private partnership policy?
Well, there's really kind of I guess two buckets. One where you're talking about understanding data. So all of these organizations, public or private or governments, and everyone's got their data, and AI is kind of a general bucket. There's different kinds of machine learning, fuzzy logic, different kinds of things that helps you work with data or understand data, and you need to have a kind of a fundamental working knowledge of the data to even apply those tools to really kind of maximize their impact. And it's a very kind of wide spectrum of things that you can use to apply to optimize the use of this data. I think in a private and public partnership of any sort, it's important to have a degree of transparency and explainability in the AI that you're using. You don't want necessarily a big black box with some magic answer coming out that no one understands why. And the other thing that I think we're more focused on is the use of collective intelligence in these sorts of situations, especially when you have large constituencies where you know, irregardless of education, irregardless of whether it's they're a poor farmer or an educated city person, you know, everyone is intelligent and has a potential contribution that they can make to their whatever their group is. And I think being able to use collective tools so that people can develop solutions on their own or as a collective, where you can overcome biases, you can overcome some of these problems with that you typically see in groups. I think is probably where the most impact from these kinds of tools, like what we're working on in terms of using AGI or AI kinds of technologies in helping to develop policy in groups, is by not just understanding the data, but also being able to synthesize and enable the members of a constituency to participate actively in the development of policy. I think from the research we've done and are pushing that a constituency, if properly worked with, generally will have the underlying best ideas for how to deal with the problems that they're most familiar with. You know, me as a farmer dealing with certain kinds of problems, it's me and other farmers and other scientists that are specific in that field, and those are the people where the best ideas specific to those the farming those solutions are more likely to come from. And these collectively policy tools or these collective intelligence systems are able to synthesize that better than, you know, a bunch of people halfway across the world that don't really have a direct connection or direct expertise in the particular problem space that we're dealing in. And I think that the more we can enable these advanced tools for groups with these sorts of collective applications, the better we can optimize the solutions in a particular market.
Thank you, Professor David J. Kelly. This is.
Go ahead, Sharif.
Yes, Mr. Mark. Yes, Mr. Mark, please proceed.
Yeah, I was going to say that there was a question from Mahdi Hassan Mahmoud was asking how will the progress of the global goals be monitored? And I think this really goes to kind of the heart of what you're talking about, David Kelly, that this combination of how you apply this data would obviously be something that would be essential to being able to get the SDGs monitored and to evaluate them. And a second question that was asked up here is that we have these problems that are going on, and how are the countries going to be able to achieve all these goals, or are they only going to be able to measure some of them? And if they do, how do we use the kind of tools you're talking about with AI to be able to evaluate those and share that information across the different boundaries that we're talking about?
Well, one of the things is that will be you're removing a lot of transparency if you're using these collective systems. For collective systems to work properly, you can't have a bunch of, you know, secret silos of data that no one has access to. So you open it up in terms of monitoring to basically anyone that's on the network or anyone that has access to the data. And I think that's probably one of the keys to being able to monitor these kinds of things is this transparency of getting the data available for everyone, so that not just me or you or a specific company or group, but everyone has access to it. Now, from a technical standpoint, you get into these ideas of tendency and PII data and different kinds of problems like that. But at a broader level, by democratizing that data or putting it out for these larger constituencies to have access, that transparency allows us to develop more trust and have basically anyone that can monitor the data, because it's all right there, available for everyone.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, if you want to add some views about this utilization of artificial intelligence in public-private partnership policy, as well as there are more questions about sustainable development goal, about the 17 goals. We have a lot of youth community. Maybe you can share some of your views about SDG 17 goal.
Sure, I would love to do that. The use of AI tools in particularly projects like this go back to even before they were called artificial intelligence. And some of the simplest approaches of AI is a tree diagram. So if this happens, then this happens. If these things happen, then go here and here. And that's really a very basic AI, all the way up to where you have deep machine learning and neural networks beginning to be used to make complex approaches to use different types of data science work. And so the history of this goes back from very simple. Engineering construction was one of the early users of some of the very basic AI. And it's been used in infrastructure for a long time, which is some of the things. If you look at the SDG goals, they came out of a collaborative group out of the United Nations and out of the group working together with them. And you saw them put in place as, how do you address the problem that we're facing in the environmental at large side of the world? And as we've talked before, the SDG goals cannot be solved just by one city, one state, one country doing it. You have to begin to work broader to have implement solutions across all the 17 goals. But taken as a whole, it provides a framework where you can begin to act on them, begin to implement things. And as you begin to do models, such as the models which Marshall has talked about earlier, to begin to look at this type of technology and implement across regions and across multiple regions, you begin to see an impact. And that's why the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are so important, is their approach to begin to take and establish these partnerships and implement them globally to begin to tackle these grand challenges. And each of the 17 goals is actually a grand challenge on how do we as a global community respond to this. So Sharif, I hope that kind of answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Mr.
Sharif, Marshall.
I'd like to add a little context here. I'm going to date myself that I'm an older man. So back in September of 2000, everybody probably that's been around remembers Y2K. Remember that, when we were converting from the 2000s and the new millennium that was coming up? So at that point in time, in September, world leaders gathered at the United Nations in New York City, and they developed what they first called the Millennium Development Goals, which were 8 of them at the time, and now have morphed into the Sustainable Development Goals, of which there are 17. Now, I think Noor is the person that asked the question, are they relevant for all countries, and do all countries need to apply them? Well, yes, the answer is definitely yes. The SDGs are sustainable. they're interconnected, and they're global. So to achieve these goals, countries need to cooperate and they need to work together. And especially very relevant, as Mark pointed out earlier, that with developing countries, especially in the southern hemisphere and island countries, they're being impacted immediately by the climate crisis. Everything from the melting of glaciers, like the Thwaites Glacier is a big one that everybody's talking about. That's the canary in the coal mine, as we call it. To other threats, both at poverty levels, at environmental levels, but they all revolve together. And I think David J. Kelly's point about making the data, democratizing data, is really crucial. I know that some countries like to keep things secret. I know that companies like to keep things secret. But in this case, I think David J. Kelly's point is that if you want to use artificial intelligence technology and specific technologies in that realm as a disruptive technology to help us achieve the SDGs, in other words, meet those goals, then what we need to do is we need to work together and to be transparent. One of the, and again, I like to harp on this. I know probably drives some people crazy, but the Climate Bond Initiative has these very stringent taxonomies, and taxonomies are rules of the road that allow investors to look at bondholders to look at what is this bond bringing to the table. And in this case, and there's several of them. There are several taxonomies. There's one for waste management. There's one for agriculture. There's one for green building. And there's several that are being developed, one on hydrogen. And of course, originally in 2009, the ones that were developed originally and issued were bonds on energy, green energy, such as water energy and solar panels and wind. So what we do know is that these taxonomies not only prevent greenwashing, but also create this democratization of data. In order to apply for the climate bond, one needs to be transparent in its data sharing. So I think the development of artificial intelligence as a tool is going to be important. And people like David J. Kelly and his colleagues out there that can help bring this about are going to be relevant to what we're doing to bring the 17 Sustainable Development Goals to be met. Also, one other thing before I hand it off is that we know that of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there's a whole cadre of sub goals underneath that, or tools that need to be implemented to achieve them. And I believe that there's about 119, roughly 119 tools that have to be applied in order to even be able to achieve these Sustainable Development Goals. So it's important that we have knowledge across the broad spectrum, as we said, that there's got to be a marriage between the P3s, as David likes to call them, the private-public partnerships, and the Sustainability Development Goals. It's imperative that we do this, and we do this now. There's not just one way to do this, but we do believe that if we're going to accomplish this in a timely fashion, we need to bring every tool to bear to accomplish that. Thank you, Sharif.
Another thing that we have to look at is that there's a synergy between the SDGs, so that they work in complementary form with one another. And as we talk about the democratization of the data, that may or may not always be possible. I mean, we may be dealing with there are plenty of countries out there that are not necessarily oriented towards a democracy or towards the sharing of information. And even within those limitations, we still are going to have to move forward to these various goals. So as we achieve the goal, let's say we're dealing with a goal of trying to address poverty by being able to bring in better paying jobs and being other opportunities for the economics of the local environment. But we also want to be able to do that while bringing in some kind of technologies and other kinds of innovations that are going to help with other aspects of it. So the jobs are now doing something that's helping the environment, or they're doing something that's restoring the water. or they're doing something that's actually helping to clean the air, to remove carbon, all these things. And the great majority of them are related to this idea of what's happening with climate change, because that is really the imminent danger that we're all facing. But sustainability has many, many dimensions to it. And so there are different aspects to what we're trying to achieve by getting these sustainable development goals, but they work in a synergistic way so that one complements the other and then helps feed into the next one. And even if we're dealing with a situation where we don't necessarily have complete open communication and sharing of data, as we move one forward, we're going to be able to see that some of that data may not be necessarily critical to be able to move the entire movement of the adoption and achievement of these SDGs.
Thank you. This is really great discussions. One thing, as I'm from developing nations and I have some clear understanding about people, about the culture. So SDG definitely very important. Definitely, even our organization, our research organization, Asia Research and Development Institution, we focused on SDG. But in the grassroots level, if you ask to the much people, like the people, how many of the people from developing nations they understand about SDG, or they know the policy and procedures or impact. I'm sorry, 90% people they do not know about SDG. The largest corporation, example in Malaysia, Sunway Group, they are working with SDG. Petronas Group, their largest group. But remember, there are many small medium enterprise. They do not know nothing. But we are not only go for criticizing, we are taking action. And that is the issue that this March, we're going to train in India with the help of Rotary Club, 3,210 students. Definitely SDG and this kind of things, artificial intelligence, Industry 4.0 will be the major things. Professor David Kelly, Mr. Marshall, Professor David Smith, even Mr. Mark, those who want to contribute for our youth community, especially developing the awareness, you can. And beside that, World Talent Economy Forums, we are collaborating with one of the largest lab from Japan. It's called B Lab. They have more than 600 researcher. So definitely the understanding the culture, what actually Mr. Marshalls and actually share with our people, because understanding cultures and do the grassroots level research is very important. So with this B Lab, definitely B Laboratory, because in Singapore they are contribute a lot. It's actually part of University Japan. Yes, with the Adelaide in Australia already they developed their lab. So there are a lot of professional people, researchers, many interesting corporations, academias, and government people. They are working together. And the directors of Nakao Ishido, she is also part of MIT. So anyway, it's a high quality research lab. So World Talent Economy Forums, we are working together, and we do not go for only discussions and dialogue. We go for more action. We go for more solutions. So Professor David Kelly, Professor David Smith, Mr. Marshalls, all of your action actually important for developing nations. I always say developing nations has lot of problem. They need lot of solutions, and they need entrepreneur like you. So if we work together, hopefully, and definitely understanding the culture, understanding the local ecosystem is very, very important. The more we can understand, we can get more success. And definitely it's a big market, a huge amount of people, 40% people populations around the world live in Asia Pacific. Infrastructure definitely is very advanced if you compare to the other part of the world. So that's why we are supporting Mr. Marshall initiative. Hopefully from the tomorrow, we will start our negotiation and dialogue with the governments. We will start from Australia, so hopefully all of our dialogue will be in action, and hopefully we will be successful. So thank you. This is really, really great sessions, and I want to give thanks all of our audience, because audience always support us. We need more of your support, because we have to understand more problem. Our target, we want to develop 1 million people in Asia Pacific. Definitely, we need more support. Those who want to support our projects, they can. So I directly want to go for the concluding remarks. First, I want to give chance Professor David Smith.
Sharif, thank you so very much. I love the quote, that the comment you have up on the screen right now. It takes urgent, and it is urgent both regionally and globally. And you have to work collaborative. You know, when you collaborate and use group intelligence, your knowledge increases to the log versus linear. And that is part of the magic of public-private partnerships, is by pulling together this very diverse group of stakeholders, you not only get the access to more funding, you get the transparency, you get the greenwashing like Marshall was talking about, but you also get group intelligence brought into it. And you get it applied in such a way that that's why these tend to be very successful, and why, particularly on an urgent problem like this, it's one of the fastest ways to get there and have the most impact to change coming out the other end. But Sharif, thank you so much again for such a great panel. And I see Sharif has dropped. So Marshall, let me throw it over to you.
Thank you, David. I think the question that Sharif posed is, you know, it is a big challenge. And as what I like about what Sharif is saying is that he's challenging us to come to the fore and make actionable developments that allow us to actually make a difference on the ground in the countries that he's talking about, the developing world and around the world. Our approach, again, that David Smith, Mark, myself, and David J. Kelly have talked about today, along with Sharif, is that we need factors to deliver success. And one of those factors to deliver success is people, technology, and the environment. So we need to put people first, bring technology, the disruptive technologies that we talked about before, so that sovereign clients can create the job creation, the foreign direct investment, the knowledge and tech transfer, and the macroeconomic performance. And we also need the environmental reduction, the reduces of greenhouse gases. We need to sequester carbon. We need to manufacture materials for environmental cleanup. And that's what corporate clients can do and actually make money at. That they can develop speed to market, profitability, and they can create a market perception of relevance and innovation to doing with ESG measurements. So we need both. We need growth, we need lower risk, we need behavioral change, and as David J. Kelly's contribution is, we need data value and we need to monetize that. So we need all hands on deck. Time is of the essence. And Sharif, I want to thank you very much for your allowing us to present this today. It's a really critical discussion, and we need more of it. And by the way, the answer to your question is an area that Mark and I have experienced over the past 15, 20 years. It's called adoption of innovation. How do you get 90% of those people out there that aren't even aware of this to be able to adopt something that is urgently needed to be adopted? That's the question you're posing. That's what we're suggesting. There is a method to this. And again, it's what the benefits to clients are, and those outcome-driven approach that David David Smith has presented to us in one of the slides that I presented today. Those 5 outcome-driven approaches, and at the end of the day, the sovereign clients, the countries that you named, Sharif, will benefit greatly. And we need to educate that process. That's where the World Talent Economic Forum comes into play. The answer to your question is you're the answer, because without educating people, they're not going to know anything. They're going to be in a dark box. And we need, as David Kelly talked about, we need democratization as much as possible of data. And the data is not the important thing. What do you do with data? Data becomes only actionable if it becomes information that you can act on. And without that, you just got a black box and you don't know what's going on. At the end of the day, we need to create these opportunities for the developing world, and we need sovereign entities, what we call the sovereign clients, the governments, both at the state level, the local level, and the national level, to come together with us. We have a method and we have a means so that we can reduce the risk and we can change behavior, and at the same time monetize the data value that we can share with people in a democratized fashion. So thank you again, Sharif, for having us, and really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Mark.
Yeah, just understanding that the vast majority of people are not necessarily going to be in the leadership roles that we're talking about in terms of being able to have the knowledge and the basis to work on things like the Sustainable Development Goals and the innovations that Marshall was talking about. Nevertheless, what we need to do and the role that leaders play is to be able to bring this information out and disseminate it amongst the population. So one of the things that you're doing by hosting these conversations, Sharif, is to actually help disseminate this information and get it sent out broadly to a much larger group of people. And the fact that you are there speaking from the developing world and bringing these conversations out there is extremely important. We need to be able to bring in, as Marshall was saying, the sovereign entities that can actually support this information getting out, because they have actually already have the infrastructure to be able to bring these kind of messagings out into the general public. As the general public becomes aware of it, and because really with a lot of people who are dealing, particularly people who are suffering from the plague of poverty and illness, it's a matter of survival. And so when that is where you're living, you're not going to be necessarily thinking about the lofty policies that we're talking about here. But these policies have a very direct effect on each of the persons that is being affected by it. So it's important as leaders, as people who are bringing these kind of innovations into the world, that we take those steps forward and allow people the opportunity to get on and become participants in the progress that we're talking about making, and about turning this very, very serious situation we're dealing with in terms of climate change and what needs to happen to bring out David Kelly's point about democratizing what's happening in terms of what's happening globally, in terms of sustainability, in terms of economics, in terms of education, in terms of all these various things that are the heart of what the SDGs are about. So thank you, Sharif, and look forward to all these conversations.
Thank you, Mr. Mark. Professor David J. Kelly, what's your concluding remarks for today? David J. Kelly, can you unmute, please?
Yeah, that might help if I unmute myself before I start making a big long speech. So the one comment I thought, I would want to add to the discussion is that, regardless of all the tools and how cool AI is, or this or that or the other bit of technology, it really is about the problems we're trying to solve. You don't just throw technology at the wall and maybe it sticks and it sounds cool or something, but it's about looking at the problems you have and addressing them irregardless of the technology. A lot of this stuff isn't that complicated or even requires, some huge massive investment of resources to get some whiz-bang AI answer. It's more about applying the best solutions to problems as opposed to the coolest technology to the problems. I think if we keep that in mind, it makes it a lot easier to solve some of these problems when it's not about how cool the solution is, but about real world results and real world solutions to the problems.
Thank you, Professor David J. Kelly, Mr. Marshalls, and Mr. Mark Sabin for joining today's session. I'm sure today's session is a really, really interesting, very informative for our audience. Our audience really enjoyed today's sessions. I request all of our audience, please share our content with your government, with corporation, and with academia. And if you need action, communicate with World Talent Economy Forums. I'm sure these are the best entrepreneurs around the world, and they definitely solve your problem. And another thing, just I want to share, because when I discuss, I always say we have an objective for the developing worlds long time, because before I started this World Talent Economy Forum, we take a lot of initiative in the developing world. We build up largest corporations with millions of people. This is experience. It's all about experience. Like not only the classroom knowledge, we get a lot of knowledge from the practical worlds with our team. We lead around 1,600 employees, those who actually solve the educational problem. This is our new visions. We want to achieve 1 million people. We want to develop knowledge-based communities, 1 million people in developing worlds. Those who want to join in our team, we are not looking for money. I always believe developing nations has a lot of financial support. They do not need money. Yes, one thing is important. This is knowledge. Knowledge is very important. If we collaborate with the developed worlds, we can solve many problems together. Definitely, we are getting so much of support from different countries, prime minister, different kings, different corporations. So hopefully with this support, we can develop an excellent community. In between next 3 years, we want to achieve this 1 million people objective. Professor David J. Kelly, Mr. Marshall, Mr. Mark Sabin, your contribution will be part of the history. That's what I'm sure. So thank you everyone for joining today's session. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Sharif. Thanks, Mark. And by the way, David, while